found. Wonderful. Okay, then I'll keep that background a little bit briefer. So what I'm saying is, I found myself in an interesting question, and that is, why don't people behave reasonable? And I think the two answers that we tend to give at scholars all the time are incomplete. The first one is because they don't know, so we should teach them how to be more reasonable. Or second, because they don't want to, right? They're just, a little evil or not caring or don't want to be reasonable. And I think the way more interesting answer is because they can't. Because there's other things that prevent them from being reasonable, other normative systems that prevent them from being reasonable. Because the imperative of be reasonable is just one of many in the communicative sphere. You might also want to be, good, or you might want to be law abiding, or you might want to be polite, or you might want to be persuasive. You might, want to follow the communicative rules of your firm to not get fired, and you might want to be funny. So I set out about 3 or 4 years then to visit those neighbors and to see what happens if those norm systems clash. What happens if I'm trying to be good and reasonable at the same time? What's happening if I try to be funny and reasonable at the same time? What happens if I want to be polite and reasonable at the same time? And they were fascinating visits. Of course, I was a dilettante in each of those neighboring fields, but that's what happens when you're a tourist. And I got stuck. I got stuck temporarily in irony and temporarily in politeness, but I got stuck really hard in humor theory because it's such a fascinating field. And that's the background for today's talk, is the intersection between argumentation and humor theory. So that's what I have. And with that, I will now officially start sharing my presentation. Does everyone see my presentation? Fantastic. So today's slightly tongue-in-cheek topic is humor theory as a branch of argumentation studies. I try to get something that gets people, engaged, if you want, in a slightly less facetious way. One could also say, what are the implications of recent findings in humor theory for argumentation theory, ethics, and law? Recent here is mostly post-Hurley, Dennett, and Adams. I'll talk about them a little bit. So in the last 10 or 15 years, really exciting things have happened in humor theory. I want to walk us through that and then explore a little bit of what that means for argumentation theory. And I think there's some really, really, really exciting intersections there. So if this is humor, this is ethics, and this is argumentation theory, then today we are here. I evidently recycled the Venn diagram from my logic class. So let me start with one or two disclaimers. The first thing that almost anyone hears when I say intersection of humor theory and argumentation, they hear humor practice and argumentation of, isn't it really great for convincing people, for persuading people, for reasoning, when you're also funny and witty and all of that? And that's absolutely true, and none of my business today. That's a fascinating field of what happens to your reasoning skills when people make you laugh and people make you, put you in a humorous and lighthearted mood. But that's not today. Today really is the intersection of humor theory, of what is the driving force, psychologically mostly, but partially also linguistically, behind the elicitation of mirth as opposed to the creation of reasoning. So that's one important disclaimer. Let me then start picking up our communities. Like let me start giving you the background in humor theory in case you haven't heard much about it before I have one further quick disclaimer. Anyways, for those of you that are not that familiar with argumentation, with humor theory, my apologies. As argumentation theorists, we have at least three things in common. Number one is we are surprisingly old. And most people think of argumentation as something quite recent, but of course, going back to Aristotle, as does humor theory. Secondly, we are significantly larger than most people think. Like we actually, we are a thing. Like you can actually study argumentation and humor, and they have their own journals and their own conferences and such, like the LPS that Andrew just mentioned. And finally, you're going to run into trouble when your Uber driver or your hairdresser ask you what you do. When you explain I'm an argumentation theorist or a humor theorist, the answer is always what? So we have a lot of commonalities in that regard. But of course, that's probably mostly where the commonalities between argumentation theory and humor theory end. On the surface level, today we want to go a little bit deeper. So I promised a second disclaimer. That second disclaimer is between the difference of humor and laughter. We need to get that out of the way, of course. They're both really fascinating human phenomena. There is evidently an overlap between the two, right? Humor and laughter ideally overlap. You laugh because something's funny, and because it's funny, you might laugh, but they're very much not the same thing. Where humor and therefore humor theory deals with mirth, right? That's the positive, almost chuckling inner feeling that you have about something. Laughter is an expression, but laughter is very larger in that regard. You could laugh out of embarrassment, nervousness, sympathy, politeness. There's so many other forms of laughter. So only because we're dealing with laughter does not necessarily mean we're dealing with humor just yet, and vice versa for that matter. Hence my picture of laughing battle cry that I Googled there in front of you. So the two of them do coincide frequently, but they're very much not the same, and that's super important for the exploration that we have ahead of us together today. So let me then give you the quick background, 5 minutes or so of humor 101. I apologize to those of you that are super familiar with the basics of humor theory, but we will need it for now. In front of you, the three gentlemen stand as examples for the big three. When you open in an introduction to rhetoric, introduction to communications, etc., there will be this shamefully small section of humor theory, and most likely the first thing that will come up is a brief butchering of superiority theory. The gentleman standing for that here is Aristotle, evidently, and in a nutshell, it's something along the lines of we laugh because we enjoy not being the poor bugger that just fell, slipped, landed on his nose. And it's almost a form of anti-sympathy. I see you falling on the nose. I'm glad you're not badly hurt, but more than anything else, I'm really, really happy it wasn't me, which is why I laugh. So I enjoy that comedy of the people doing all of the silly things because it isn't me. So that's Aristotle oversimplified in a nutshell. The second of the big three is relief theory. The gentleman below you probably also recognize is Freud, who stands here also as a placeholder for many people that believe in that. And that's the idea that there's some psychological discomfort. And in the case of Freud, of course, usually something to do with sexuality as well, but it's something that makes me a little bit uneasy. And when it gets released, I'm relieved that it's gone, and my expression of relief is laughter. Right? So that's this resolution of that psychological tension. And then the third big one, the gentleman with the funny head, is Bergson. What I could have also taken Kant here as a placeholder for that is incongruity theory, probably the dominant of the big three, but it's hard to say. And here to say that we notice that two things don't fit together, and that non-fitting together somehow triggers laughter or triggers mirth as a reaction to that. There's a lot of refinements on that. What exactly does it mean for that misfit? But somehow we seem to find certain forms of misfit amusing. So that's the big answers of the classical three. I want to add a fourth one, a very powerful one. That's not a game changer, but it's one that I think deserves a rightful place in that line of four, and that's McGraw and Warren, who stole an idea from Tom Veitch and then run with it. What they labeled that as the benign violation theory. And the benign violation theory say things are funny when you have three conditions fulfilled. First up, some norm needs to be violated. That could be a linguistic norm in the case of a pun. It could be a politeness norm in the case of banter. It could be a moral norm, legal norm, etc. So I'm doing something in breach of a norm, but I'm doing it in a safe amount, meaning either my violation is benign or the norm is relatively benign or the norm is a backup norm for something else. So no big danger here. So I'm just, testing a norm a little bit, breaking it a little bit, but that it doesn't create a sense of fear or danger or anything out of the norm violation. And as an audience member, I perceive both of them at the same time. So I see there's a violation, I see it's no big deal, so I think it's funny. That theory, I think, is hugely powerful, but not so much for the prediction of humor, of when something will be funny, but almost for a reverse analysis of humor. And there can be a really, really powerful tool. And I want to give you an example for that. You might be familiar with the gentleman in front of you. He used to be the president of some of you. And what you can do with benign violation theory as a tool is beautiful. If they're right that things are perceived as funny when people violate norms that the audience perceives to be benign, then you can listen to people in the presence, in the past, in front of audiences, test what kind of violations the audience respond to in laughter, and thereby deduce what kind of norms the audience held. So this isn't super interesting about the speaker, but it is fascinating about the audience, particularly if you can keep other effects stable, such as in the event you have in front of you, the Alfred Smith Memorial Foundation dinner, which happens every 4 years and has a old white guy who happens to be present speaking in front of a pretty similar audience. And the kind of jokes they make change, and the kind of jokes for which they get a laughter also change. And that's really fascinating across the different topics. Anyway, so that's what you can do with theories like benign violation theory. And in and of itself, that's, I think, pretty cool. But that's only the background for today, because all of those 4 big theories that I've introduced so far have one thing in common, and that's they're mostly how theories. So how do we elicit mirth? Also, of course, when and to whom, but the important bit is what they're missing is the why. What is mirth even good for? Why would I, as an entire species, if you want, why would I want to deal with mirth at all? And that's a really, really important question. So why do humans across times and cultures spend considerable time producing and observing humorous activities? That's not a rhetorical question. That's a real question, a driving question, an important one, because the more you think about it, the more concerning it gets, right? Creating mirth is a huge waste of time, right? Picture yourself in, like in a evolutionary setting, and you're somewhere around your campfire or somewhere around your cave, or I don't really care, and you start, I don't know, entertaining each other, and you laugh loudly instead of, recovering or sleeping or looking for food or any of the other things. That's just objectively a really, really bad idea. So why do it? Why would we, engage across cultures, across times? Why would we want to engage in humor? Now, the easy answer to that is, well, just as easy as it is useless, is because it's fun. But I just like doing it. So if you won't get a positive psychological response to that, but of course that's just begging the question of what's the good in that positive response, because typically when we have a pleasure response in an evolutionary setting, the core of that pleasure is something that's really, really useful for survival. Say, for example, food, right? Like I really enjoy all kinds of different foods, and especially the ones that are high in sugar and high in fat and all of that, because originally speaking, when we are talking through the selection on a species level, eating highly nutritious food is a good idea. Evidently, we are overdoing that. I'll get more about that later. But originally, that's a great idea. Same with puzzles, like the kind of satisfaction I get in solving a problem that's been keeping me really engaged for a while, and then wow, I finally have it, is something that evidently for me as a group, as a species, as a family, etc., is really useful. So gratifying that with pleasure is also nice. And evidently the first one that comes to mind is sex. As a sexually reproducing species, giving a pleasure feedback for engaging in sex makes a whole lot of sense. So why humor, right? Like if I get a pleasure that is ultimately similar to those kind of pleasures, sometimes stronger, sometimes weaker. I don't care if you're more into laughter, entertaining, etc. You're more into sex or more into puzzling or any of the others. There's, of course, at least a dozen I could here mention. But why create that kind of pleasure if there's no evident use for it? Why would we want to, what's the good in creation of mirth and thereby also in the creation of laughter? Now, there's one thing I want to quickly get out of the way because it came up in a earlier version, a spin of a talk like that, is saying, I do assume we live in an evolutionary universe. For any of you that think that we don't, like, I mean, the biggest candidate, of course, for that would be a young Earth creation. None of what I'm about to say makes any sense, because then it's not a puzzle. Then, God created us with mirth, or he didn't, or she didn't. So this is really not a problem. But as long as we are dealing with an evolutionary universe, this is a key puzzle. Why provide us with pleasure for something that's useless? And the answer to that is because humor isn't useless. And in comes the answer that I advertised before, and that's the answer provided by the three gentlemen in front of you. That's Hurley, Dennett, and Adams, who say that the creation of mirth and creation of humor serves a really, really important evolutionary purpose. And that is ultimately the evolutionary purpose of cognitive debugging. And I want to go into that a little bit further into detail. In their own words, our theory posits that the elicitors of mirth are the commitment of an active belief, the discovery that that commitment was made in error, covertly by heuristic leap, and the lack of interference from other overpowering emotions. That's a mouthful, and I want to unpack that a little bit. So what they are assuming is that as we develop, as many of you are engaging with, as part of your work in argumentation theory, complex cognitive systems. Those cognitive systems deal with a vast amount of data, as we all knew for a while already, and as AI people are finding out right now. It's really, really hard to search through all options systematically because it just explodes. The amount of data explodes. So what we developed as humans is what psychologists model as just-in-time spreading activation mechanisms, meaning in order to get a handle of the vast amount of data and possible choices and possible informations that I could be dealing with in any moment in time as a human, I am building jitter spaces. So these just-in-time spreading activation spaces that allow me ultimately, if you want, an analogy prediction. Finding fields of things that make sense in the given setting. So it reduces the amount of things that I'm thinking about out of the total amount of things that I could. Now, those jitter spaces work really, really well for most of the time, but sometimes they create mistakes. And if we just leave them untouched, basically, if we are fine with jumping to conclusions all the time, we will start making more and more mistakes. So we need a debugging routine. And that debugging routine is humor. My apologies, I'll be back in 1 second. And back. So that's the purpose that they have for humor, and they built the entire book that they wrote, Inside Jokes. A really, really recommendable book, setting out to support that hypothesis, and I want to look into the hypothesis in a little bit more detail. So what they then have is they position that here are the 5 conditions for successful creation of mirth. You believe in something, that something has covertly entered, so you didn't think that through, you just thought about it by association. You take it to currently be true, but then you find out that's actually false. Now, not necessarily through deep reasoning, but for example, in the resolution of a pun, by finding out that the other solution was actually more fitting, and then you're slightly embarrassed and it jumps over. So those things are not really deep, but importantly, you found out that your quick leap to a certain conclusion was false, and at the same time, you don't encounter an overriding emotion. If you want, that's the safe condition in the benign violation theory. So if at the same time you now fear for your life, that's not funny. But if you only caught yourself or caught someone else in a false leap of reasoning, then that's funny. And that's huge. That's really, really big, because that means that humor works as that kind of debugging routine in fast reasoning. And of course, most of us in argumentation theory are quite familiar with now what 30, 40 years or so of the distinction between slow reasoning and fast reasoning, or if you come out of comm studies, the elaboration likelihood model, or any of those versions that say you can really think it through or you can jump to conclusion. And what they're saying, yes, and we do the jumping to conclusion all the time. And in order for that to work, we need to keep the space clean, and we do that with the evolutionary creation of mirth. That's a really big deal, and that has consequences. And those consequences is what I want to look into with you. Now, a quick side note. That kind of theory, the idea that mirth is the debugging routine for Jitsa spaces, also explains why we encounter mirth, humor, but not laughter, just humor, only in a very small group of species or families. That's either limited entirely to humans, or perhaps to homos, or to homonini. As you see on the left of your screen is a Neanderthal, on the right is a bonobo. We don't know exactly how far it goes, but it does require those spreading activisms. So a higher form of cognition than, say, for example, a kookaburra that can certainly laugh but doesn't have humor can do. So that's a welcome side effect, if you want. Anyways, so let's look now into the consequences, and those consequences are grave. And that's where we come to the intersection of humor for argumentation and for ethics, with a lot of fascinating complications yet to come. First consequence, if they're right, and again, I think they're making a really, really good case for that they aren't. I think we'll find out as the empirical data continues to accumulate that theirs will be the dominant explanation for humor's existence. The first implication then is that we might be underappreciating humor. We think of humor as something that's fun, so you might as well do it, and that's cool. But we don't necessarily think of it as something that is socially essential, beyond perhaps, the bonding mechanisms. We know that it's good to laugh together, and it's good to have a beer together, and it's good to, have friends, and humor plays a role in that, but the role is bigger. The role of humor, if early Dennett and Adams are right, is kind of that of a cognitive trash man. So if you don't have enough humor in your society, don't have enough humor in your interpersonal space, things will start smelling, right? Because no one brings out that trash that your fast cognitive leaps had. That's important. That means that, we really ought to give more respect to those that create humor and to those that attempt to create humor, similar as we would to, other people that are essential workers in our society. That's important, especially in the case of failed humor. So if someone has been trying to help you to bring out the trash, but inadvertently, kicked our flower pot, maybe we should cut them a little bit more slack than what we would if, it was just useless and enjoyable. All right, so that's one really important bit. Secondly, of course, if humor theory is just as important as they claim, we should have way more professors of humor. This is totally not a self-serving point. I'm just saying, like, we should definitely study more humor theory. The happiest professors I could find on Google, for some reason, do physics. I don't know why that is, but these here stand in as humor theorists, evidently. So the philosophy professors with all of their big bugs. And then finally, and I think even more fascinatingly for us, if they are right, then argumentation theory has a new neighbor. Then we could think of argumentation theory not as a positive negative in the sense of we can study positively, say, for example, the rules of pragma dialectics or the rules of normative pragmatics or of informal logic, etc., of what makes arguments good based on like the positive felicity conditions versus what makes them bad in the fallacy studies, but also what makes them funny. So now, if I want to test if a piece of reasoning is any good, I could then say, A, does it follow, the rules of reasonableness? B, is it not a fallacy? And C, is it not funny? That's kind of fascinating. That's an area and territory that I think we should explore more. So that's it for at the very first approach. Unfortunately, there's a twist. And that twist is big, and that twist is something that's giving me a big headache. And for that, we need to go back to that whole evolutionary purpose of humor as compared to others. Say, for example, food or puzzling or sex. And I want to zoom in on sex here for a extended allegory, although it's not really an allegory, it's a comparison, to be honest. So in sex fun, right? So the normal procreation sex to most people is enjoyable. That's what evolution has created for. So when you have sexual intercourse, you get those kind of pleasure benefits for. But humans, especially relatively recent humans, are fantastic in hijacking that by, for example, producing porn. That was one of the things that got me into trouble with safe search in my university computer. Or for masturbation, that was the safest picture that I brought up there. Or also, for that matter, for protected non-procreative sex. So we isolate the pleasures that evolution has built in, but do something with them that is still as pleasant, or sometimes even more pleasant, or similarly pleasant, while at the same time ignoring the original purpose. That's not a problem for sex itself, but it may be a problem for humor. So if the two of them do indeed function similar, and again, this is more than a figurative analogy, this is a comparison. If in that sex is like humor and that the pleasure derived follows a certain purpose, then what is the porn and masturbation and sex with a condom equivalent of humor compared to sex? We need to solve that, because before I said, hey, if humor serves all of these purposes in society, then we ought to deal with it. But if humor is pretty much 90% just porn, then all of those benefits suddenly go away again. Happily, I think we can isolate that. But one quick thing I want to get out of the way, also based on, coming later, based on feedback that I got on an original for that, by absolutely no means am I saying that for sex, we still need to procreation purpose. There's a whole lot of reasons why you should protect sex and saying, go sex away with whoever you want, however you want, as long as you have, like a consenting other adult that you're doing this with. For sex, we don't need that kind of justification. But for humor theory, we do. Because currently, the best we have for humor theory is indeed that it's pleasant. But I'm arguing, of course, that it is more, that it is also this kind of for creation. I hope that's a really important part to distinguish here, saying we all know that humor is fun, but I'm saying it might be more, right? Like it might be that core from which it derives that we can still unpack and make useful. But for that, we then need to distinguish. But happily, we have at least half a solution. And that is that when we look at humor theory and the mirth that we experience, there are actually two different purposes that derive. And this is where humor starts being quite different from sex. In sex, there's one evolutionary purpose, and that is the creation of another human being. In humor, there's two different purposes. One of them is looking at the object, the cognitive object, the product of a reasoning, if you want, and saying humor can be used as a debugging mechanism for the knowledge that we share. Secondly, humor can be used as a debugging mechanism for how you arrive there. So one of them is focusing on the product, and the other one is focusing on the subject. Now, happily, our porn and popsicle problem is only a problem when you're dealing with product-focused pod humor, not when you're dealing with thought humor. So when it comes to improving the reasoning skills of individuals, a pun or joke, even if it's artificially created, could still be of benefit. So perhaps the analogy I should have gone with in the beginning wasn't the analogy of sex, it was the analogy of puzzling. So think of puzzles, say, for example, when someone creates, I don't know, like Agatha Christie creates this really, really interesting case and invites you to think about it. Whenever you watched an Agatha Christie movie or read an Agatha Christie book, you have never, ever in your life solved a real murder, because that thing wasn't a murder, you didn't contribute. But you might nevertheless have improved your own reasoning skills with regard to murder. And you could go even further, and I'm sure they do that in the training of police, training of detectives, training of criminalists to do exactly that. I mean, that's what we do in mock trials, moot courts, in all kinds of other educational puzzles. We do just that. So in that regard, the thought humor is immune to our porn and popsicles problem, and that's important because that means that we do indeed have this higher evolutionary purpose. That's what I have from here. I want to illustrate that and joke that Hurley and Dennett and Adams actually gave us. What they gave us here in front of you, a member of U.S. State Senate known for his hot temper and acid tongue exploded one day in mid-session and shouted, "Half of this Senate is made up of dunces," which I think is a very polite way of swearing on people. All the other senators demanded that the angry member withdraw his statement or be removed from the chamber. So to which he responds, "Okay, I withdraw what I said. Half of the Senate are not dunces." Now that's a fascinating joke in so many different ways. I hope it's also funny, but it's of course humorously fascinating in that it shows really well the overlap of understanding reasoning and understanding humor, and why the jump to conclusions we did here in the logical and pragmatic implicatures out of switching from a positive half to a negative half might have been amusing. So where do we go from here? This is almost my last slide. If Hurley and Dennett and Adams are right, and again, I think they have a really, really good case from here, then I think there are fascinating but complicated path ahead. One path that deals with humor and the subject, and one with humor and the object. And I think there's a couple of questions here that I think are worthwhile or even burning to explore. And again, please take these as non-rhetorical questions, but as questions that I think as homework for us as a discipline, if you want. So on the subject-oriented debugging side, I think we have some things to do to test. And one of them is whether, if they were right, then being funny should enable you to have a sharper look onto your fast heuristics, which in turn should sharpen your reasoning skills. So if I want to make people better reasoners, there should be a correlation here between becoming a better reasoner and becoming funnier. And that's not necessarily easy to test. Actually, there's a whole lot of problems in here. But if they're right, this is an empirical field where we could verify or falsify what they're saying. Secondly, that's if you want the reverse point of that. If the humor decoding requires a understanding of overcommitments in fast jitter spaces in fast reasoning, then similarly, if I get better in having a sense of humor rather than creating something funny, I should also be better in critically testing reasoning. And third on that side is if they are right, there should be then humor and reasoning skills should be more closely related in human cognition, as probably visible in developmental phases or perhaps in the acquisition of language skills as well than other cognitive skills. So that's also something we should be able to isolate. But that's of course the problem, right? Like we have a hard enough time defining what's good or bad reasoning in order to then put it into questionnaires or other forms of testing. Defining what's funny and not funny, because it is so subject and context dependent, which of course is very much not the same thing as arbitrary, but it is very subject dependent. It will be very hard to isolate. Hard, but not impossible. So that's the subject oriented. On the product oriented debugging of humor, there's another set of interesting questions, I think. The first one is exactly leaning on that senator joke there. When is faulty reasoning funny? I think we have all seen examples of that. Are all faulty reasonings in a certain paradigm, for example, when they're benign, also funny? Secondly, and here with this, we are almost getting to the applied part of that, is saying, can humor, the applied humor, the one that's created out of the humor theory, be used for rebutting and also for preventing faulty reasoning? For that, the final problem isn't here on that side, comes the porn and popsicles problem, of course, of what part of that is created just to be bad, and what part of it can be used to distinguish between good and bad spaces. Now, we are not entirely hopeless. We are not entirely defenseless to the porn and popsicles problem, of course. And the final thought I want to leave for that is mostly that of Duchenne laughter. I don't have time today to go into much of that, but we can, with a pretty high amount of certainty, empirically distinguish between the kind of laughter that correlates with mirth and the kind of laughter that doesn't. So we do have the opportunity to test for funniness based of humor as opposed to for awkwardness. And that's thanks mostly to the French gentleman, Duchenne, Swiss, I'm not entirely certain, gentleman that we have in there, which is why he gets a honorable mentioning on our muddy roads ahead. In one of you find Mr. Duchenne on my last slide of help. Thank you.